Laksanakan tugas dan tanggung jawabmu dengan sebaik-baiknya, sesuai dengan peraturan perundang-undangan yang berlaku, sesuai dengan sabta marga dan sumpah prajurit yang kalian junjung. Dengan bekal pegangan itu, kalian dapat bertugas tanpa harus selalu dilibat kekhawatiran mengenai pelanggaran hak asasi manusia.
My name is Jacob Rumbiak, and I want to my country of West Papua to be independent.
In November 2001, Tea Sulai, the chairperson of the West Papuan pro-independence body, the Papuan Presidium, was abducted and killed. Almost 6 months later, elite members of the Indonesian military, or TNI, have been charged with his murder. The Indonesian government strongly opposes the notion of West Papuan self-determination, and anybody promoting the idea leads a dangerous life. In late August 2002, violence erupted at the Freeport gold and copper mine in Timika. Indonesia has attempted to lay blame on the separatist movement for the death of 3 Freeport-employed schoolteachers. But strong evidence has emerged to suggest that the Indonesian military is in fact behind the crime. The western divide of the island of Papua has a troubled history.
It all started when Indonesia became independent, basically in 1949. And after they became independent, or as part of the process for independence, the Netherlands, the Dutch government, held back West Papua.
The Dutch argued that West Papua should become an independent territory on the grounds that Papuan people are Melanesians, not of Southeast Asian descent. Their cultural and religious practices are very different to the rest of the Indonesian population. During the 1950s, the Dutch, with the support of Australia, worked towards a blueprint for West Papuan independence. However, the newly formed Indonesian government, headed by President Sukarno, father of Indonesia's current President Megawati, had other ideas for the resource-rich province and launched a military campaign.
There was a small invasion of West Papua led by General Suharto, whom we all know, and paratroopers were dropped into West Papua at the end of 1961. And in an attempt to solve that problem, the United States brokered an agreement called the New York Agreement in 1962, which ended the conflict between the Dutch and West Papua, and the United States really twisted the Dutch arm behind their back and forced them into the agreement, really. And one of the requirements of the agreement was that there be a vote held within 7 years of all adult Papuans, so that they had the opportunity to vote for their future.
The New York Agreement wasn't a carefully considered document, but it did give West Papuans certain rights. In 1969, Indonesia, with the help of the United Nations, facilitated the Act of Free Choice, in which the Papuan people would supposedly decide on the fate of their land. However, Indonesia only allowed 1,022 of the 800,000 West Papuans to take part in the referendum, and the hand-picked group were threatened into voting for integration. The Papuans call the vote the Act of No Choice.
There are stories of people having threats of having their tongues cut out, or that their whole families or their villages would be destroyed if they voted for independence rather than for integration. And so, not surprisingly, 1,022 Papuans voted unanimously to integrate with Indonesia.
West Papuans protested against the conduct of the referendum. Australian journalist Hugh Lunn witnessed the Indonesian military respond violently to the Papuans. UN officials in West Papua chose to ignore the substantial human rights abuses that took place. With the support and inaction of the international community, Indonesia had successfully claimed its 26th province. Since the Indonesian occupation of West Papua, Indigenous Papuans are killed almost every day at the hands of the Indonesian regime. Although the Indonesian military were the puppet masters of violence and destruction in East Timor prior to independence, rogue elements and militia groups were widely used as a scapegoat to shift the blame from the Indonesian government. Similarly, there is growing evidence to suggest that the TNI are soliciting others to carry out their dirty work in an attempt to discredit and destroy the pro-independence movement in West Papua.
There certainly is physical conflict, and the conflict is being created mostly by the military and to a lesser extent by the police. Right at the moment there is a police crackdown on so-called separatist leaders.
They can't afford to do those big massacres, so one thing they have done and are doing is poisoning leaders, paying poverty-stricken West Papuans in villages different to where they want to get the person poisoned, to put stuff in cups, and it's an old trick.
The TNI has sponsored the migration of thousands of young Javanese men into West Papua, and pro-Indonesian militia groups are being established there. The Laskar Jihad, an Islamic extremist militia army, is also operating in the province. Since the overt destruction of East Timor in 1999, the Indonesian military has been declared state-sponsored terrorists by human rights groups. Yet both Indonesian and international governments continue to blame the violence and killings on rogue elements.
It's definitely not rogue elements. It's the orders come from the top, as they did in East Timor.
There have been numerous statements from President Megawati, who has said that she will defend the integrity of Indonesia no matter what it takes. There have been statements by the head of the armed forces, the TNI, Major General Eduardo Sutarto, and he has said that he will crush the separatist movement in West Papua and in Aceh, for that matter.
I think the statement that rogue elements of the Indonesian military are responsible for human rights violations is actually a myth that serves the interests of both the Australian government and the Indonesian military government.
The present violence in West Papua is being orchestrated by the very same figures that were responsible for the decimation of East Timor. Despite this, the Australian government maintains its support for the Indonesian regime.
TNI will remain a fundamentally important institution in Indonesia. As a secular organisation, it will remain key to the government's efforts to promote tolerance and harmony between Indonesia's many differing faiths.
Oh, well, Australia has always been ambivalent. Historically speaking, anything to do with Indonesia, we've had this ambivalence, and you could also call it impotence. You would never call it ignorance.
Australia has a long history of training and arming the Indonesian military, including Kopassus, the Indonesian Special Forces. That training includes training inside Indonesia, training in Australia, and also supporting scholarships to Australian universities. As well as that, Australia arms the Indonesian military.
Australian Defence knows exactly what went on in East Timor and knows exactly what is going on in West Papua. So it's unforgivable that we sit and do nothing.
West Papua is rich in natural resources, and transnational corporations have long exploited the country, reaping millions of dollars from mining and logging operations. Both BP and BHP Billiton have active operations in West Papua, and their practices have attracted concern from environmentalists and Indigenous Papuans. But the corporation that earns most of the spotlight in West Papua is Freeport-McMoRan. This US-owned business signed a work contract with Indonesia 2 years before West Papua was legally under Indonesian governance. Freeport is the world's biggest gold and third biggest copper mine, and is Indonesia's largest taxpayer. Since it began its operations in 1967, Freeport has caused massive environmental and cultural destruction. Like many profitable businesses operating within Indonesia, Freeport-McMoran has close ties with the Indonesian military.
The Indonesian military is funded by the Indonesian state to the tune of only 25 to 30% approximately. So what that means is that 70 to 75% of the revenue for the Indonesian military comes from illegal and legal business activities. So one of the ways the Indonesian military funds their operation is providing security to corporations.
As well as paying for security services, Freeport funds the building of military facilities and makes an annual donation of $11 million to the TNI. Ongoing human rights abuses on Papuans living in the mine region are orchestrated by the TNI security services, which are paid for by Freeport. Calls for an independent inquiry by human rights groups have consistently been ignored.
I think Indonesia will break up unless it does something about treating itself as a serious confederation. It's always had a policy, or at least a rhetoric, of unity and diversity, but really the unity has been all and the diversity has been treating the outerlying areas as provinces.
In 2002, the Indonesian Parliament granted West Papua special autonomy from the Indonesian Republic. As part of the package, 70 to 80% of revenue from natural resources will now be returned to West Papua, and more decision-making powers granted to the province. The fact that the administration of West Papua is predominantly comprised of immigrants from Java and other parts of Indonesia means that the new laws will scarcely benefit the indigenous peoples and do not allow for genuine local decision-making by the tribal population. Countries such as Australia and the United States have urged West Papua to accept special autonomy. However, the Papuan leadership, who has come to know the Indonesian government and the TNI on an intimate level, has rejected the package.
Some of the new right in Australia will make this as a very explicit claim. It was better under a totalitarian regime in Indonesia than it is under the chaos of the moment. I think that Alexander Downer is not uncomfortable with the idea of pragmatically considering whichever regime comes along, that the simplest one is the best one. What we're describing is a really complex kind of nation state, or confederation of nations within a nation state.
Despite the Australian government's lack of support for our neighbour, West Papuan leaders know they will achieve independence one day, and when they do, they will not simply implement a Western democratic model of governance for their land.
We combined international law, positive international law, national law of Indonesia, also our traditional law, and positive God law. So we mix it, because when independent coming in a problem in custom problem, we must solve by traditional law.
Over 250 tribal groups make up West Papua. Although all Papuans share common aspirations for independence, tribal groups have their own languages, customs and beliefs.
And what we're seeing with leaders like Jacob Rumbiak, what he's doing is thinking about what it is to be a nation culturally, socially, economically, politically and militarily. Rather than concentrating on just development issues or political issues, it's also the cultural question of how you bring people together, how you think about one nation within which there are many different nations with different tribes, different voices, how you think about being democratic without treating that modern idea of democracy as wiping out the tribal chiefdom system, which I think is not democratic but still a valuable part of the way of life of those people. So it's a different kind of approach to the whole question of national sovereignty they're engaged in.
The OPM, the Organisation for a Free West Papua, has been fighting for independence since the Indonesian invasion in the early 1960s. Its composition and objectives have changed many times over the years. Today, it is a network that brings together many different factions within the independence movement. The OPM and the Presidium Council are part of the United West Papua National Front, which was formed in February 2002. The TPN, or the West Papuan National Liberation Army, is the OPM's military wing. They are a proud fighting force, even though the mostly traditional weapons they carry can in no way compete with machine guns and aerial bombing campaigns. Although the TPN has carried out offensives against the Indonesian military in the past, in recent years they have pledged a non-violent path to independence. They will, however, fight back if they are attacked.
So as long as Indonesian military have an attack our liberation army, and they will quiet. But as long as Indonesian military try to disturb them and attack them, we have, the right of defense.
Strong suspicion tonight is that Islamic militants with links to Al-Qaeda were responsible. Bali's closeness to Australia has long made it a magnet for holiday makers.
The bomb attack on a Bali nightclub that killed many Australian tourists has initiated Australian government interest in cracking down on terror within the region. The establishment of a joint Indonesian and Australian anti-terrorist task force will undoubtedly mean yet more Australian government funding and support for the Indonesian military. In the rush to join the so-called war on terror, it seems that both Indonesia and Australia have conveniently overlooked the TNI's relationship with militia groups. Supporters for a free West Papua question how many more West Papuan deaths and how much more violence and terrorisation at the hands of the Indonesian military may well be facilitated by Australian taxpayers.
Lots of military in West Papua after bombing in Bali, but it's not make people of West Papua they fear or they're afraid. So I think military can't solve problem of West Papua, but understanding between Indonesia and West Papua only can solve problem of West Papua.
That independence movements just don't go away. And for West Papua it's not a matter of if it becomes independent, it's a matter of when and how it becomes independent. We hope that it doesn't require a repeat of East Timor to make countries like Australia, the nearest neighbour for West Papua, to wake up to the fact that there are going to be hundreds, thousands of people slaughtered right on our doorstep if we don't step in now and try and solve the problem.
Papuans have been living in harmony with their environment for thousands of years, and the claim that they are too primitive to manage their own affairs is completely unfounded. The people of West Papua have been served a grave injustice by the international community, who have largely stood by and watched as the Indonesian regime has seized and exploited their land and terrorised their people. The West Papuan struggle for independence continues to intensify, and international support for the campaign is slowly mounting. Indonesia is in a unique position to rid itself of its image as a violent neo-colonial power. By heeding the demands of indigenous peoples and ending the military violence and oppression, Indonesia has an opportunity to build a new relationship, not only with Papuans, but also with the rest of the region.
I hope grassroots of Australian, Pacific Islands, and also international community to help and support struggling of West Papua, because it is a part of peace and justice.
Coffee's now gone cold, smoky evening finds its graceful end, and down the hallway the shouting's all but done. So cautiously behind the bedroom door there's something wrong.